Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Hartford History Lecture Series. We've been doing this since 2018, every fall, and I see some familiar faces out there and lots of new people as well, so welcome here. My name is Jeff Partridge. I'm a professor of English at Capital Community College, and I run the Hartford Heritage Project, which is our place-based teaching and education initiative that connects students with Hartford and through their curriculum and doing things like our professor Jerry Murphy is doing tonight, bringing his students here to learn something about Hartford from Bill Hosley, who he and I have been working together since 2018 on this. We made it through the pandemic and have found sponsors along the way who have helped to make this free. There will be opportunities to give through this series if you want to donate to the series. But we have found sponsors along the way, which has been great. And Connecticut Old State House joined as a partner a couple of years ago, and we've been holding them over here with CTN, which is based here, doing wonderful recordings and live streaming and all of that. It's just a professional production that we really appreciate, and we're so happy to be partnering with them. We also partner with Fiona Vernal, professor of history at University of Connecticut, who will be our speaker next week. So come back next week as well. We'll be having every Thursday for the next several weeks. Next week, Fiona Vernal will be talking about ethnic communities in Hartford that were reported in the Hartford Current around 1915, and talking about those communities, but also how they were reported and how that fits with the way we talk about communities today. So tonight's speaker is known to many of you, and I also want to welcome our online people as well who are tuning in. Bill Hosley has contributed content each year from the reservoir of material he's developed during his 40-plus years of service to the Hartford heritage community, beginning with his years as a curator and exhibit developer at Wadsworth Atheneum, as the first curator of the ancient burying ground, and later as director of Connecticut Landmarks. His passion for place, past, and community are well known, and they have inspired me through the years to do what we do at Capital Community College. So please join me in welcoming Bill Hosley.
And thank you all for showing up, and for our online viewers, welcome. This has been a great labor of love for me. When I started working in Hartford in June of 1980, in the first week on the job, I was at Wadsworth Atheneum, and I walked across the street to check out the ancient burying ground. And I've never stopped checking out the ancient burying ground and all of our many very interesting historic cemeteries and burying grounds. And for me, this is literally like the best way to come up to speed about the history of a place. Whenever we're traveling, if we visit a new place, it's always great to start right in the cemeteries. You really get an idea of what a community was about, where it's, when it was prosperous, what kind of industries it was in, etc. Now, let me see if I can do this. Yeah, this is Christine, my wife, is in the front row here. We both are, well, some people golf, but we go to cemeteries and graveyards. That's our hobby. And fortunately, I'm married to somebody who enjoys it even more than I do, I suppose, but certainly as much. And during the pandemic, we both retired from our, there are many seats in the front if you like. Anyway, retired, and we spent during the pandemic 100 days, visited 800 graveyards and cemeteries, and took almost 8,000 photographs. So you won't see them all, but we love this stuff. And you know, just to start out with, I'm going to do this chronologically. We're going to see a lot of cemeteries, a lot of cool stuff, but it's kind of in the order in which these burying grounds and cemeteries were created. Hartford had a burial spot for its first generation descent residents as early as the 1650s, and this is it, the ancient burying ground, and it is really in many ways a national treasure. And two of the people associated with the ancient burying ground who deserve recognition, Daniel Wadsworth himself was the founder of the Ancient Burying Ground Association and was one of the contributors to the creation of the Founders Monument. I'll show that in a moment. And then Emily Holcomb, we were just in the next room looking at the exhibits, and she is described as a preservationist par excellence. She saved the ancient burying ground. She raised money. She saved the old State House. Back in 1910, there was yet another initiative to bulldoze it because you can never really have enough parking. Well, I don't think that was the reason, but she stood up to the wrecking balls of this and that, and she was a wrecking ball. She's one of my heroes. And this is the Founders Monument that Daniel Wadsworth created back in the 1830s. And just to go quickly through some of these things, one of the reasons Daniel Wadsworth was so passionate about Hartford history and about the institutionalization of preservation is because he had such illustrious ancestors in Hartford. His grandfather, this is his father's monument in the ancient burying ground. Jeremiah Wadsworth hosted George Washington as a house guest on, I think, 2 occasions. And this is his grandfather, who was the minister of First Church. His name was Daniel Wadsworth. So this is Daniel Wadsworth's grandfather on his father's side, and then his grandfather on his mother's side was the governor of Connecticut. So this was kind of a high-stepping guy with a lot of connections to the past, and he did a lot for it. In the ancient burying ground, the oldest gravestone, it's got its own little marker that says that, dates 1648. That will be 400 years old in the not-too-distant future. And this is the earliest style of gravestone here. This is one in the 1660s. And so, there aren't that many places in America that have 17th century artifacts to point to that tell their story. So that's all good. And these are some of the things you pick up just poking around. Both of these gravestones from 1724, same year, no relation, talk about the fact that the people buried here were from far away. In this case, Bristol, England. Also, Bristol, England. Bristol, England is a Western English port city that a lot of the immigrants to America came from. And this guy, John Tyler, Susanna's his wife, he was a silversmith. I'm into the crafts, and he made some really cool things. This is, as far as I know, the earliest gravestone that contains a little figure, what they sometimes call a soul effigy, a little face. And it dates to 1692. People that know Windsor, Connecticut may know that there is the section of Windsor called Wilson. The Wilson section of Windsor is named after this guy. He must have lived up in that area. And apropos of nothing, Wadsworth Athenaeum owns his candlestick. Now, all you have to do, it's made out of pewter. All you have to do is look at that, and you know that's a luxury item, and that the gravestone was too. So Phineas Wilson must have done well. Other little things you don't find everywhere in Connecticut is this slate gravestone. Connecticut was famous for brownstone, marble, and granite. We did not have slate quarries. So if a slate gravestone appears in the ancient burying ground, that's because it was probably made in Boston and shipped here. Well, who is this guy, Samuel Wentworth? His older brother, pictured on the right, became the future governor of New Hampshire. His name was Benning Wentworth, after whom the town of Bennington, Vermont is named. And he looked I don't know whether it's important or self-important, but he's got the look, and that is about 1760 and shows you how people, aristocrats, people of high station, turned themselves out in that day. A lot of different, in fact, the Hartford Ancient Burying Ground has a wider variety of stone cutters, colonial stone cutters represented there than anywhere else in Connecticut. And that's because Hartford was pretty cosmopolitan and had connections to a lot of other towns. It was a center of government even in colonial times. This is a stone cutter whose name is not, to my knowledge, been identified. He's known as the Glastonbury Lady Stone Cutter. It wasn't a woman who did it, but I guess he did a number of gravestones of women. This is Rebecca on the left and Martha on the right. And it's just an example. And then just if you like folk art, to me, some of these folk carvings represent the highest achievement in our American art in the colonial period. If these things were paintings or tavern signs or needlework pictures, you know, they'd be hanging in museums and worth lots of money because they are precious, rare, and to me, quite interesting. This is, again, just the geography. Sometimes you can learn things. And a lot of the research for this has happened over many years, not just by me, but by others. On the left is Rachel Messenger, who died in 1737. Her father was from New York, which may explain why that gravestone is from New York. And we know that because of the style of it. It's not a Connecticut style of stone cutting. On the right is work by John Hartshorn from Norwich, Connecticut. And he's well known in that part of Connecticut, and that marks the grave. The Johnson brothers family in the Middletown area were the most prolific colonial gravestone cutters, and they did these death heads, these little angels with the skull, and they're Hezekiah Brainerd on the left. I remember my late dear friend Bill Foudy liked to let you know that he was a descendant of one of the founders of Hartford, and that he was connected to all that through Hezekiah Brainerd on the left there. So that was his one of his favorite gravestones. And then Thomas Lyman, same stone cutter. One of our favorite stone cutters is a guy named Gershom Bartlett, who was incredibly prolific and businesslike. His gravestones were all over Connecticut, mostly central Connecticut. And in 1771, he, after 20, maybe 25 years of making gravestones out of his shop in Bolton, Connecticut, he moves up to the absolute end of the world, to the frontier of New England, which was Hanover, New Hampshire, and Norwich, Vermont, where he continues to make gravestones in this style for the next 20 years. And gravestones tell stories about occupations. Don't know much about William Brown, but we do know he was a counselor at law in 1803. Moses Butler was the tavern keeper whose family became the Butler McCook House, and he is also buried there. Thomas Hooker, this is his table monument. He's known as the founder of Hartford. The fundamental orders are often cited as the precedent for self-rule, for constitutional democracy, because the Congregationalists at that time had a democratic system of governance, which was unique at the time in America. And Thomas Hooker dies in 1647, so we don't have a lot of artifacts. And I think this gravestone probably was done a generation after he died, but not this one. This is my favorite thing. This marks the grave of his assistant, Samuel Stone, who then became after 1647, he becomes the primary minister of the Congregational Church in Hartford. This stone, it marks his grave, and he died in 1663, and I believe this stone is made about that time. And he was is the earliest documented gravestone maker in all of New England. He was based, not Samuel Stone, but Matthew Griswold, who made this, was based in Windsor, Connecticut. It's the earliest gravestone maker in New England. And it took years of lighting. They finally, I won't get into it, cut down a tree that was dying that overshadowed it. Very hard sometimes to read these things. And Christine and I, we sometimes get up on ladders to take pictures like this one so you can really see from above. Anyway, what it's got there is an original indigenous work of poetry. And there were no books of poetry at the time, so who knows what people wrote. But Hartford, by Rich Jules here in turn. This is original, I don't know who composed it, but it's really a very cool thing. These table stones, if you had a lot of money and wanted to go out in style, table stones were the way to do it. And this is marks the grave of David Gardner. This is a little obscure, but Gardner's Island, Long Island Sound. The eastern part of Long Island was part of Connecticut at this time. And so the east shore of Connecticut, if you know, the Hamptons and Montauk and that area, and Gardner's Island was part of it. He was up here, I think, maybe he was in the legislature. Sometimes they bury people where they died. And his claim to fame, such as it is that he was the first white child born in Connecticut, for what that's worth. And then next to him is Reverend Timothy Woodward. So these ministers and kind of lead people like these table stones. These are two more. John Allen was a giant figure in the 17th century Hartford. He mastered the Native Americans' languages, and he was the primary diplomat for the colony of Connecticut in negotiations with the indigenous people, of which there were many, and there were many challenges in that. And this is all ancient burying ground. Enos Doolittle was the Paul Revere of Connecticut. He made clocks and bells and silver. He's buried there. These are some of his products. And then John Bouchon and the Chenevards. These are both French names. And you think, well, I thought it was English people, but it wasn't only English people. It was also these French Huguenots who migrated to America in the early 18th century and often got involved in merchant affairs and were quite prosperous. This is Lieutenant William Knox, and he lets you know right on his gravestone he was born in Strabane in the county of Tyrone in Ireland. And he was a tavern keeper in Hartford. One of the most popular gravestones in the ancient burying ground is this, which marks the grave of Israel Seymour. He was a potter. He made red-ware pottery. That's an example that was with Athenaeum. And the reason it's great, besides the fact that it's really large and ornate and impressive, the story is that he was standing in the door of his house when there was an electrical storm. There was lightning that killed him in the doorway. He dropped him right as he stood there, and there was a long passage in the Hartford Current about his death and how it happened. They were pretty superstitious back then, so you can be pretty sure the Sunday after he died, the good minister reminded people that one must prepare for death because you don't know the hour in which you will meet your maker and be judged. So that was the world they lived in. Emily Holcomb, again, the restoration work that she undertook in the 1890s was path-breaking beyond measure, and this was a bronze plaque, a tribute to her. She was married to the president of Phoenix Bank, so it helped, I suppose, to have social and business connections. But she raised, in the 1890s, today's equivalent of, I think, $1.4 million to do the first comprehensive restoration of a colonial cemetery anywhere in New England. And these is a list of all the donors, you know, people who, maybe the larger donors, but Mr. Samuel Cole, you know, the list, it's kind of a who's who of Hartford at the time. This, did I skip over? Yeah. And this is a rare photograph that I only recently discovered of the dedication when they cut the ribbon on this restoration work. Look at the huge crowd that turned out for this. This is, again, honoring this incredible 3-year achievement. And then a year or two later, James J. Goodwin, who was a member of one of the richest families in Hartford, hired Stanford White to design the gate that is now around the ancient burying ground. So that cost a pretty piece of change to get that done. When I moved here, I got involved. Jeff mentioned I've been curator of the ancient burying ground. I did that part-time for a couple of years. We wrote a book about it, and the stewardship and care of historic burying grounds and cemeteries is work that never ends. And there are many, many places that need what we've done here, and that work continues under the Ancient Burying Ground Association. This was back in the old days when the Hartford started having more money than they knew what to do. It turned out that their founder, gravestone looked like this. You couldn't read it, but in 1877, the state historian had gone around and written down all the inscriptions so we knew what the words were. And this was the most expensive project we did. The current paid for it, made a reproduction of the printer of the Hartford Current from 70. He was a Revolutionary War era printer, and his name was Ebenezer Watson. Then in the early 90s, got involved. Billy Anthony, a good friend who did incredibly path-breaking work in the 80s and 90s, using her secondary school students to do research on, this is really the beginning of an interest in African American history here in Hartford, and that continues. But up until this point, you'd ask most people that claim to be interested in history what they knew about the presence of people of African descent in the city in the colonial times, and the answer generally was not much. Well, we've learned more and more and more, and in the 1990s we created most poor people were buried in unmarked graves, and there are no colonial gravestones in Hartford marking the graves of enslaved Africans. There are some in Norwich and Middletown and a few other places, so they aren't unheard of. We just don't have any here. But in the 90s, we created this collective monument to the free people, slaves, and 5 black donors who rest in unmarked graves in Hartford's ancient burying ground. That was a very cool thing that was based on the work of a Newport, Rhode Island, a black stone cutter who worked in colonial Newport in making gravestones. Well, moving on, this is Old South Cemetery is a different site, and it's gosh, is it on Maple Avenue? It's sort of a funny place because it's it's almost as big as the ancient burying ground, and it looks like it's 1/10 full. Like they began burying people there and then they stopped. I'm not sure why, but it's a big open, well, it's not open because they got a chain link fence around it. Green space. One thing about Hartford that is not well known is that until the Stone Arch Bridge, which is still there, off Sheldon Street, until that was built in the 1830s, the south end and the north end of Hartford were almost different places. You had to get a ferry to Forest Street to get there. They finally built the bridge, and things began to blossom in the south end. And so this is the cemetery for that. And there are some interesting stones there. Jonathan Bull on the left, Reverend Abel Flint, who I spoke about last year in my topic on Hartford as a center of religious book publishing. He was one of the most famous clergymen in America in the 1820s. And then the first mayor of Hartford, Thomas Seymour. They're all buried there. And there are Revolutionary War veterans. And there's also Ebenezer Watson, who the current restored his gravestone, or had enabled us to reproduce it. His wife, after he died, there's an exhibit in the next room talking about Hannah Watson, how when her husband died, she just picked up the reins and kept publishing the Current and kept the business going in the 1770s. And she eventually marries the next publisher of the Hartford Current, so she kept it all in the family. His name is Azalea Hudson. So in death, her name is Hannah Hudson. Died in 1807, that's her gravestone. And she's in the South End. In 1808, Hartford opens a new cemetery in the North End called Old North Cemetery. And it is a place I cherish. I've spent hundreds of hours there giving tours and doing research and just loving the trees and the environment and that sense of peacefulness that surrounds everything about this beautiful site. And it's up on North Main Street, right across from the Sand School. If you've never been, I urge you to take a look. And, you know, trees. The nice thing about cemeteries is they can plant a tree and it can grow to huge, and nobody's going to cut it down. They leave them alone. And there are some champion trees in Old North, which means they're the largest trees of their type in Connecticut. And this is, you know, different seasons of foliage, and it's just pretty to look there. And look, there are a lot of people. Last year was the bicentennial of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted, who's one of the most famous people born and buried in Hartford. He's buried in Old North, and we had a big event I did with the Connecticut Landmarks marking that celebration. Daniel Wadsworth and his wife are both buried in Old North. I always love her gravestone. Her name is Mrs. Faith Wadsworth, wife of Daniel. But lest you forget, she was also the daughter of Governor Trump. So she was kind of strutting her credentials there a little bit in the afterlife. And this was another, anybody that could answer how many governors the state of Connecticut has had with the last name Trump would deserve the prize. I don't think anyone's going to raise their hand, but I think there were 4. And the most recent was the governor in the 1920s whose son married the sitting president, Calvin Coolidge's daughter. And that was a big news story. You know, Connecticut governor's daughter gets married at the White House. That's pretty cool. Anyway, this is another governor, Trumbull and Old North. And then William Ellsworth was the governor of Connecticut. At the time, he had been Prudence, he had represented Prudence Crandall in that epic story, and he was the governor at the time of the Amistad event and was a great champion of the anti-slavery movement that was hitting the ground running. Sam Colt is not buried here, but he designed this gravestone, and he had it erected 8 years before he died, and it was made by James Batterson, founder of Travelers Insurance Company, who was also a monument maker. That's in Old North. When he finally did die, his wife, Elizabeth Colt, buried him in the backyard. But then she had a second idea and decided it might be cool to be at Cedar Hill. So that's where he and she and the rest of the family are. Horace Bushnell, I mean, Old North is just loaded with these personalities and great stories. Horace Bushnell was a nationally renowned clergyman, writer, author, visionary. Bushnell Park named for him because he was a great champion of the park, creating an urban park back when there were none, and then also for creating the first public high school in Connecticut. George Brindley wouldn't mean much, but he had the greatest antiquarian book collection in America. He was a descendant of Israel. These are all figures in Old North. Mason Fitch Cogswell, when his daughter, he was a doctor, when his daughter Alice was born deaf, he said, that won't do. We're going to do something to make her life easier. And more than anyone else, he was responsible for bringing education, founding the American School for the Deaf, and the movement around that was large. Oh, is that?
For the recording, Bill.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll do what we can. Anyway, Butler McCook House, when I was the director of landmarks, it was one of our properties, and there are a lot of family buried there. Dr. Butler, who was a Revolutionary era doctor, MD, and then his son, John Butler, manufactured paper, and they just were regular folks in a way. They did well. Then this is the Charles and Louis Ledyard Weld this is a monument in Old North made by James Batterson at his monument works. They were the sons of Reverend Louis and Mary Cogswell Weld. Reverend Weld was the principal of the American Asylum for the Deaf, and in 1863, the government founded the 41st Colored Troops. At the beginning of the Civil War, people of African descent were not invited to defend, to participate in the military efforts, but in about mid-war, they were, and there were 178,000 colored troops enlisted during the Civil War, an underreported story. Weld, after graduating from Yale in 1854, becomes the captain of the 7th Regiment of Colored Troops. He died in January 1865 on the Appomattox River. So both he and his brother were involved as officers in the Civil War and in the leadership of colored troops. There's an exhibit in the next room on this fellow. William Rice is the most famous, maybe not like winning the Super Bowl or being Taylor Swift, but he's the most famous tavern sign artist in America. And there are wonderful examples of his work at both Wadsworth Atheneum and Connecticut Historical Society. He's buried in Old North. Lydia Royce, we did some restoration work a few years ago. This stone had been split in half and was lying face down in the mud when we recovered it. We put it back together. She's really interesting. She ran one of the first schools for girls. It was a private secondary school, Lydia Royce's Academy, where they taught the girls, among many other things, needlework. This is an example of the kind of work that they did there. David Watkinson is also Watkinson Library, Watkinson School. These were some of the great philanthropists and leaders of that early generation. He's buried there, as is Eli Todd, who was the doctor who was the first superintendent of the retreat for the insane. Hartford had the Institute of Living is a mental hospital, and it was one of the first in America. And Eli Todd, who's buried there, ran it. This is James Hosmer and his brother. He lived to be 97, and he was involved in various business affairs. That's a portrait of him at the Connecticut Historical Society. Other aspects of African American history. On the left is a stone marking the grave of John Crabtree, who died at Fort Wagner in 1863 during the Civil War, one of the first important battles where African American troops played a leading role. And anybody that's seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, will know that story of the 54th Regiment of Colored Troops and Fort Wagner. On the right is a grave. If somebody wants a research project, this would be awesome. The earliest gravestone marking the grave of a person of African descent. He was a man of color, was born in Virginia, and since came to Hartford in 1802, dies in 1832. A little hard to read all this, but it's quite an inscription, and there's got to be a backstory. He was not an enslaved person. He was a free black person who obviously had some kind of business and success enough to have commissioned, or his descendants commissioned, that gravestone. This marks the grave of the person who built the old State House. John Leffenwell was an architect builder. He also built Center Church, and he's buried in Old North. There's a Jewish section of Old North. I'll get back to that. There's also a Catholic section, and the religions tended to self-segregate in those days, and the opportunities for scholarship are endless and abundant. And this is me and Mike Fothergill. We're giving tours of Old North, which I always love to do. Half a mile up the road on the left is Spring Grove, founded in 1845, and it is even larger than Old North and was the primary cemetery in Hartford and for about 20 years until Cedar Hill was founded. And this is some of the, Hartford has a new cemetery, Cedar Grove Cemetery. Stephen Page was the superintendent, and it's located right across the street from Faith Congregational Church. And, you know, it's not just all people are interesting if you learn about them and if you get to know their story. But the famous people get more attention, and this is one of them. Frederick Church was literally the most famous artist America had ever produced up to that time. This is in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. He was born in Hartford. He is buried in Spring Grove, and this is his little house that he built with his profits from selling paintings over in Catskill, New York, or Hudson, New York, I guess it is, in the Hudson Valley. So he's famous. Edward Bartholomew was almost as famous in his lifetime, but he didn't live long, and so people don't know his story as well. He was a sculptor. Wadsworth Atheneum has a lot of his work, and this is his gravestone in Spring Grove. And then Henry Clay Work was one of the most popular songwriters in America in the Civil War era and beyond. He's buried in Spring Grove. Passing through, you can Google Henry Clay Work and find, in fact, he's probably got a Spotify page, you know, I mean, he was a pretty important songwriter. And then there's Laurent Clerc, who was they hired from France. He moved here. He was the person who developed and perfected the American Sign Language, which is still used today for people with hearing disability to communicate. And he is also in Spring Grove and a visionary. Lydia Sigourney, before the era of Harriet Beecher Stowe, was the first woman in America to get rich writing. As a writer, she wrote poetry, but also prose. She produced something like 32 books during her lifetime, and she is buried in Spring Grove. I'm interested in ironwork and iron railings, and the George S. Lincoln and Theodore M. Lincoln Company, they had a business in Hartford that did decorative iron work, and it was one of many industries, but the Lincoln Iron Works was famous in its day, and that's the family tomb there. Dotha Bushnell, whose Hillier, whose father was Horace Bushnell, married a guy, Appleton Hillier, who had a lot of money, and her philanthropies were famous. She's the one that put up most of the money to build the Bushnell Auditorium, and that's in Old North. I won't, but I could go on and on. The Trumbull family was like a family of geniuses. This is not the government Trumballs, but the art and history Trumballs. And Gurdon Trumbull was a painter, and Annie Trumbull Slauson was a ceramics collector. Their Henry Clay Trumbull was an author who wrote about Christian education. He was one of the pioneer figures in getting the Sunday school movement. Obscure historical detail, but quite interesting. They're all up there in Spring Grove, as is John J. Corning, who commissioned the Corning Monument in Bushnell Park to honor his father, who was buried here. This is Frank Merriman Ball on the left, just beautiful aesthetic works of art. I don't know a lot about him, but that's in Spring Grove. And the Leish German family in the upper with the iron surround. And the Allen, this is gone. How you would burn this, I can't imagine. But it was destroyed by fire. And this is a pretty opulent gravestone, wouldn't you say? But it was the family crypt for the Allen family built in the 1870s, and I think it was destroyed in the 19-teens or 20s. This is silly stuff, but the Daughters of the American Revolution, when they first started in the 1890s, would just go out of their minds in the presence of a real daughter. And this woman here, Tasia Parsons, was a real daughter, which meant her birth father had been a soldier in the American Revolution. It seems like kind of a goofy thing to obsess over, but they loved it, and there's a real daughter up in Spring Grove. There's also Emily Malbone Morgan, who helped found, these are all things you can Google but probably won't, the Society of the Companions of the Holy Cross, which is an organization that still exists. They ministered to women working in the nearby textile mills by establishing houses throughout the Northeast where they and their children could take vacations. And it was a lovely kind of philanthropic thing to do. She also donated this amazing house full of amazing stuff in Brooklyn, Connecticut. But she was a Hartford resident, and that's where she's buried. Thomas Sedgwick Steele, won't go into too much about him, but he was another artist and outdoorsman who popularized camping and mountain climbing in the outdoors. His family had a jewelry business that he went into for a while, but he didn't like it very much, and so he spent most of his time camping and painting. And again, just there's something, May and October are the best months to hang out in these cemeteries because the trees are so beautiful. It's foliage, and they really, you can't overstate how beautiful these trees are, and this is Spring Grove. Well, the crown jewel of Hartford Cemeteries is certainly Cedar Hill. This is where the Gilded Age giants, people, J.P. Morgan and others, were buried. And it is gorgeous in any season. My friend Andy Hart is the greatest photographer we've ever had this city. He does more big-hearted work documenting and capturing, and he goes out every day with a camera, and I love him. And these are some of his pictures. It was designed, Cedar Hill Cemetery, it's by Jacob Wiedemann, who also designed Bushnell Park, and these are images of his. The Northam Chapel at the entry gate. This is at the south end of Hartford, on the Wethersfield line is where Cedar Hill is, but it's well worth a look. Horace Wells, famous for making modern dental possible, dental work possible, anesthesia, and he is another giant historical figure. There's not only his gravestone, if you want to call it that, on the right, but the first work of public statuary, the earliest one in Hartford from, I think, 1870 or 71, is a statue of him in Bushnell Park. Elizabeth Colt, after she decided that burying Sam in the backyard wasn't maybe the best idea, she spent more money than you would have thought possible to bring Batterson out again to do an even bigger monument. When this was new in 1865, nobody in Connecticut had ever seen anything like it. The size, the detail, imported granite from Scotland, with all these bronze mounts. Elizabeth Colt was the richest person in Hartford at this time, and she didn't mind spending money honoring her deceased husband. The Church of the Good Shepherd and its incredible parish hall, I'm sure many of you know, were also examples of her philanthropy. Well, Katharine Hepburn was with us until fairly recently, but she is no longer. And she was devoted to Hartford her whole adult life. And in the end, she also chose to be buried with the rest of her family in Cedar Hill. That's a picture of her as a little girl on Forest Street in about, I forget what year she was born, 1904 or something. J.P. Morgan, who was, kind of the, he was like one of the 5 richest people in the world. And he didn't make his money in Hartford. He grew up here, and he moved to New York and London, and that's a whole story. There are many, many books about J.P. Morgan, but his philanthropies are extraordinary. I'll be talking more about that in the last program in the series where I talk about Hartford, the Wadsworth Athenaeum's first century. He's buried in Cedar Hill, as are the Goodwins, who were his cousins, and these are impressive monuments. So there's that as well. And any of you, if you're friends of Keeney Park, or you know my beloved Keeney Clock Tower, I love that clock tower up in the north end. A lot of treasures up there. Will have heard perhaps the names of Henry and Walter Keeney, 2 of the great Gilded Age philanthropists, left more money to more good causes than any 10 people we know. And they're up there in Cedar Hill as well, as is the then controversial Governor Thomas Seymour, who was the governor on the eve of the Civil War. He'd been a hero of the Mexican War in the 1840s. And why he's controversial, you'll have to take one of the tours there at Cedar Hill to find out. And in this, a guy like who I'll also talk about with the Athenaeum's first century, Albert Pitkin was the first curator at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. He was also a prolific collector and a visionary and a really interesting person. A few years ago, Trinity College had a group of academic scholars from China that came visiting, and I was asked to take them give them the Cook's tour of Hartford, and they really wanted to go see the grave site of Young Wing, who was an educator who came from China in the 80s, and brought Western education to China. And it was a really big turning point in Chinese history. So not everybody, but, well, I guess if you got 1 billion people, maybe hundreds of millions, know who Young Wing is. And he's buried. And they all wanted, this is them coming to pay reverence to him at the gravesite. General Griffin Stedman, I love Civil War monuments. He was a general in the American Civil War. These are all in Cedar Hill. And then the most colorful thing, I suppose, is the pyramid marking the grave of Mark Howard. That must have cost some money. And this is Robert Skinner. Ebenezer Roberts is the guy that actually built the Isham Terry house. the first owner of it, and the Hughlines, who were not as well known today, but Hughlin Tower out there in the, is that in Farmington or Avon, or is it, I forget where it is. What? Avon. It's in Avon. It's great. You want to take a hike? It's a great, easy hike to get up to Hughlin Tower. And Newton Case, Lockwood, and Brainerd were Hartford used to be a major book publishing center. And Case, Lockwood, and Brainerd were still in business, I think, into the 1950s. And then this is George Beach. This was designed by the architect of the Connecticut State Capitol, Richard Upjohn. And so there's a lot of stuff. And Cedar Hill Cemetery, has a staff, has resources. They have an endowment. They take care of stuff. And they do lots of programs. So, go on one of their tours sometime. And you'll really like it. It's great. Less well off, but equally interesting in many ways, is Zion Hill Cemetery, which is near Trinity College, and it opened in the 1840s. And I don't have too much, I haven't studied it that closely. On the lower left is a stone marking the grave of Lieutenant D.P. Dewey, who was a member of died in the Civil War in 1863 in Irish Bend, Louisiana. Fighting became intense. The Confederates attacked, forcing the Federal soldiers to fall back. But their victories assured the success of the expedition west into Louisiana. So that's all part of Civil War history. On the right is William Webster, who died in 1861. That was Daniel Webster's son, who lived here in Hartford. And then this has the largest concentration of veterans' stones in any of the cemeteries I've talked about. And for decades, the veterans of the Civil War would have their annual events, their ceremonies, during what we now call Memorial Day in Zion Hill Cemetery, this is the Soldiers' Field shown there. And speaking of the Irish, I mentioned Irish Bend. This is not great. Most people don't really even know it's there, but St. Patrick's Cemetery is behind Old North and is a little worse for wear. There's a lot there. It's a beautiful spot. It needs friends. It needs stewardship. It needs attention. This is where most of the early Catholics are buried. And this shows the map that shows Old North, Spring Grove, and St. Patrick's is between them. And you have to kind of poke around to find the entrance. I showed it. It's not pretty. It deserves a nice gate, something that would call attention and even tell you what its name is. And that is all possible. These are just some of the wonderful monuments marking the graves of the first, second, and third generations of Irish immigrants to Hartford. And I love this. I've never completely understood why, but the Irish people love marking on their gravestones where in Ireland they came from. And it's just interesting. Each of these does it. Native of Monaghan, Ireland. Native of Westleath, Ireland. Anyway, there's a lot. These would all make great student papers, seminar papers. And, the Irish faced hardship and discrimination when they moved to America. It wasn't easy. Every immigrant group seems to go through road bumps, adjusting to this weird, wonderful system of freedom that we have here. And I'm sure there are not more people of Irish descent in Connecticut than there are in Ireland. but I'm absolutely sure there are more people of Irish descent in the United States than there are in Ireland. It's kind of an amazing story. Uh, and Jewish burial societies, there are like 10 of them, organized. A PhD could be done on this topic. It would be so darn interesting, and I have not had the time or made the time to do the amount of work that needs to be done. But you might ask the question, why did the Jewish families need 10 different cemeteries? And the reason is, as I understand it, and my friends at the Historical Society, the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford, which does fabulous work, they've done programs on Jewish historic cemeteries and have had walking tours on occasion. But as I understand it, these burial societies were organized around the shtetls, or the villages of origin in Europe. So who these people were, where they came from, the cultural geography of their background, all of which would be terribly interesting to study. Some years ago, I did a project about the Second North District School, which no longer exists. It's now the Public Safety Building on High Street next door to the Isham Terry House. And I was just blown away by what I learned through the reports in the Hartford Current about the Jewish teachers, their role in developing curriculums that has enabled immigrants to establish themselves successfully in this city is another great underreported story worth telling. Anyway, there are many of these sites. I have been to all of them, but I won't show all of them, and I've done almost no research in any of them, but they're all terribly interesting and tell the story of this. You know, Hartford is diversity personified. Every cultural, every historical chapter in the history of this country left a little trail of crumbs that we can follow up on and learn from. Recently, I'm sorry to say, but they demolished, this was the Deborah Society, and I won't go into the details of that, but it made the news recently. This is the cemetery. This is a photograph I took from St. Patrick's Cemetery. And the Jewish graveyards tend to really pack them in tight. I don't know why that is, but this is a view of the Jewish cemetery next door. And these are, again, Beth Israel is, oh, excuse me, I took this from Zion Hill. Beth Israel is in a corner of Zion Hill. Beth Israel Cemetery was founded by Temple Beth Israel, which is now the Charter Oak Cultural Center. And people like the Auerbachs and Blumenthal and Hartman, I mean, these are some of the illustrious families in Hartford's Jewish heritage. Alas, to wrap this up, endless care, stewardship, and restoration needs. Len Holtz, who is a fourth-generation leader of the Hebrew Funeral Association that still exists, says it all about property damage, illicit activities, vandalism, littering, too few descendants around to care. Only the ancient burying ground in Cedar Hill really stay on top of all the stewardship needs, the care, the restoration that is needed. And, you know, money doesn't grow on trees. You have to set priorities. But, well, I'm not going to compare it to something we stupidly spend money on, but there's so many. So I don't think poverty is the reason, but engaging people to care matters. Here's another reason it matters. The pandemic created a surge of new interest in cemeteries and gravestones because people weren't visiting museums. They wanted something interesting, be able to look at art and history outdoors where they could do social distancing. And I say my wife and I, we just retired. We spent 100 days during the pandemic going around the graveyards. And we're not alone. And everywhere we went, we would bump into people. Tombstone tourism is a thing. And if Hartford bragged about any of the many things that we have that people will hop on airplanes to see if they know, well, that would be a different world than we've got. Programming matters. The tours they do at Cedar Hill, the tours we occasionally do at Old North. My dear friend Mike McGarry, he does first night, New Year's Eve. And every year he calls, I'm not doing it today. I said, Mike, I'm done. But every year he calls, he says, God, we got to get you to give a cemetery tour in New Year's Eve. What are you, nuts? Well, one year it was literally like 15 degrees. And that was the group that showed up. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I'll do it. And another year it was pouring rain. And I just, I'm getting a little old. But I do tours when the weather's nice. And this is me doing one on the left. And my friend Mike, Father Gill, and Ruth Shapley Brown, who's Connecticut Gravestone Network. And this is a group of us last year at the Olmsted Bicentennial. And, it's just programming. If you do stuff and people turn out, you can't love things you don't know. So the more you know, the better the chance there is to love what you see. African Americans in North Hartford love this story. Old North Cemetery is on the African American Freedom Trail. It's the largest concentration of black Civil War veterans in the state of Connecticut are buried there. And they do events every year, and we've done different things, and, it's all good, and it's all part of engaging the public. Teaching, learning, and civic attachment are the key to happiness and joy, which couldn't be exceeded by the joy I have in seeing all you here. Thanks so much for coming out. Didn't go too far over. Is there any comments, questions?
Yeah, so Bill, if people have questions tonight, you're able to take some? If you want to stay behind, just get a microphone in your hand.
Yeah.
And if you do have a question, if you could just raise your hand, this way we can get a microphone to you, just so the larger watching audience can benefit by your question. Anybody?
Anywhere you've been? Oh, yeah, go. Yeah.
Sorry. Hold on. If you get behind the photo, there you go.
This is more a comment than a question, but a side thing that I noticed, especially the really old graves, was the names of people. And I am not trying to make fun of anybody, but to have people with the first name Phineas or Hezekiah or Ebenezer shows you that it was a long time ago, because I don't think anybody today
It's all
would name their...
biblical.
Yeah,
It would be-
biblical, and you wouldn't see that today.
It would be hard to overstate the degree to which Christian theology, language, knowledge, scripture, everybody in this city was versed in that stuff. And they named their children after figures. Some of them are there was a famous stonecutter named Zerubbabel Collins. Now, I will have to get out my biblical thesaurus to figure out who in the Old Testament Zerubbabel was, but that's the idea. And there are a lot of interesting, my wife Christine here collects women's names. Who is it? Free Love Frisbee. The Free Love was the first name, but there are lots. What are some of the ones? Silence. Patience. Temperance. Lots of unusual names. It's not Bob and Bill anymore. Well, although it hasn't been that in a while. Any other comments? Yeah.
Having shown all of these cemeteries, I'm curious to know if you're aware of cemeteries that were lost or displaced during construction or have been refound during construction.
I don't know of any. I don't think Hartford ever bulldozed, but there could be discoveries like that, and there have been in other places, but I don't think there have been any here. Yeah, yeah, Jack.
I wanted to mention Northwood. You missed one Hartford
Oh,
Cemetery.
is that the veteran?
Huh?
Where is that?
It's adjacent to Keeney Park. It's actually in Windsor, but it's a Hartford cemetery, and it's where the unidentified victims of the
Oh, the
Hartford
circus
Circus
fire.
Fire has a monument there. It's a huge soldiers' field up there, which is really amazing because the gravestones there, they're the standard Veterans Administration gravestones, but it lists what role people had,
Ah,
like if they were a cook or a
oh, you're killing me.
mechanic or whatever. And the other thing that's up there is a pauper children's section.
Yeah, wow.
It's real heartbreaker, but another interesting older place to visit.
I'm embarrassed to say I've never been there. Is it entirely in Windsor?
I'm not sure where the town line is, but
Right,
it's
yeah.
right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say just north of the Windsor line.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's not. It's
I've heard
off
about
of
it.
Main Street. Yeah.
And I feel ashamed to have never been. Shame.
Well, I hope you get over it.
I will, promise. That's done. Any others?
Question for you, Bill. You talked about how we can't love a place that we don't know, right? So I want to tee you up to say like your little 1-minute elevator speech on that. And I'll set it up this way. In Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huckleberry is complaining about all the ways that living with the widow Douglas and Miss Watson, he has to conform and he has to learn and he has to study and all this stuff. And so she's trying to teach him the Bible, Miss Watson. And he says, she starts teaching me about Moses and the bulrushes. And he says it's, which was interesting for a while, but then she led on that he'd been dead a considerable long time. And I lost interest. I don't take stock in dead people. So why should we take stock in all these dead people?
Great question. I mean, we are all, if you want to be a member of a contributing member to a community, you have to take an interest in that community. Now, lots of people move around and they've got their bags packed and are ready to go. I arrived here 43 years ago from Vermont and New York State. I'm not from here, but I took an immediate interest in it, and that has not stopped. And I feel like it's made all the difference in my life. It's enabled me to be, hopefully, of some use to the community. But I also think gratitude. Everything around us, the building we're in, the roads we drive on, were created by somebody else, usually. And it's, to me, the duty of every generation to try to add a layer to the well-being of their city. And so you care about a place if you know them a little. The more you know, the more you're likely to care. And I think that sense of what I call civic attachment really starts by opening your eyes to the world of wonders of history and art and architecture, culture, and yes, even gravestones. Plus the gravestones are all these personalities. So you really, I love it. There are refreshments, and also be remiss in saying we have this series mostly runs on volunteerism, actually. Nobody's getting rich doing this, but we do have a little grant money to support a few little things and to engage people, and we hope some of you or others in the future will want to speak on topics. But, and next week will be, Fiona Vernal on why Hartford's ethnic history matters. Great. But we got a little grant from a donor-advised fund at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, which does not cover everything. So if anybody wants to donate, That's a QR code. It's on my personal Facebook site, on the Hartford Dwellers Facebook site, and there's a flyer in the next room right near the cookies. So thank you again for coming out.
And I'll just add too that the Hartford Heritage Project is at CT State Capitol, which is Capital Community College, a former name. And we're doing a lot of work to connect students with this history through coursework and that kind of thing. And so, you know, anything that you would give would support that as well. So, you know, don't feel like you have to, but if anybody wants to contribute to it, please do. And let's join me in thanking Bill Hosley for his lecture. Hope to see you next week and in the coming